Yeah, I think the billions to trillions approach was predicated on the fact that the needs for sustainable development goals, for climate change adaptation, etc., are in trillions. And it's very difficult to figure out what a trillion is. I mean, we know it's one followed by a number of zeros. So it's a lot of money. And compared to that, public resources, in particular resources which are channeled through multilateral institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, EIB, African Development Bank, and so on and so forth, represent roughly 150 billion per annum. So 150 billion per annum to go to trillions. That is a challenge. So there is a gap, obviously. So how do we bridge that gap? There are two main avenues. The first one is mobilizing what we call domestic resources, which is basically public and private resources, taxation. So people need to raise money on their soil, and that's what the advanced economy have done a long time ago. It doesn't mean that any developing country must rise to the 30 or 40 or 50% tax to GDP rate that advanced economy have, but they must move away from the 5-10% that usually we find today. So that's the first important thing. We need also to mobilize savings locally. I was impressed to see when Egypt decided to finance the enlargement of the Suez Canal, basically they made the decision to enlarge this with local savings, and they found billions under the mattress because people keep them at home, they don't put them in the system because they don't trust the system. So we really have to work on the countries themselves, and that's where multilateral institution can help. And I'm very happy I sponsored a joint approach by the IMF and the World Bank to help work on taxation system. How do you collect money? It's as simple as that. So that's the first element. In terms of dollar amount, it's absolutely crucial. The second one is to mobilize private money from outside. So investment from outside. And that's where I think money from a development institution is critical. Because this is a money that, again, it's a small amount, but it's a signal. It can be catalytic. It can really be leveraged. So people will join if the World Bank, for instance, and others become as much mobilizing institution as financing institution. Again, with $150 billion, you can finance $150 billion of projects. That's all. But if you start to leverage and engage with the private sector with $150 billion, then you can go to the trillions. And that's what is at stake. I think there is no SDGs that can be achieved by the public or the private alone. So every SDG requires some form of public-private cooperation, which sometimes can be a public-private partnership, not necessarily a partnership. So you need to combine efforts. And it's difficult, because in our world, most people stay on their lane and have trouble to work with others. It's true actually between development institutions. Everybody wants to work on its own, and cooperation between development institutions is difficult. So cooperation between public and private sector is difficult. Again, we have to acknowledge these guys don't have the same objective. I mean, as we all know, private sector is led by profit, and it's good. That's part of the market economy. And public sectors have different objectives, which are not necessarily the same as the private sector. And it's okay like this. How do you make them work? That is the challenge. That is a challenge because they suspect each other. So we have to work on that. And we also have to remind people that a PPP is not just about sharing finance. You use the right word, it's about sharing risk. You don't have a risk aversion per se, because if you have a risk aversion for every risk, you stay at home and you don't do anything. Is that there are risks that are better handled by the private sector and risks that are better handled by the public sector. So basically the success of a PPP is really to allocate risk to the people that can best bear them. That's important. I mean, political risk remain with the public sector, definitely. And construction risk can go with the private sector because it's their job and so on and so forth. So it's not risk aversion per se, it's really the right combination of things. I used to say that we should call it P4C. What do I mean with that? Painful but profitable public-private cooperation. It's painful because it's difficult. It requires people, time, understanding, etc. But it's profitable. When it's working, it's the best recipe. Well, I think it's crucial. It's not one or the other. You will have influence, and it's okay. Just, of course, for trade, official flows, diaspora flows, etc. So you cannot disconnect advanced economy from emerging economies. That's being said. I think the big change since we had the Millennium Summit in 2000 is that people recognize now that so-called South-South cooperation is crucial. I mean, people are borrowing from experiences in other parts of the world to do what they do. I mean, one of the examples, I mean, Brazil was one of the first to do the cash transfer, conditional cash transfer. But this has been exported to Africa, and it's working. Of course, it has to be adapted. It's not the same population, the same needs, blah, blah, blah. But that's the type of things that can work. It's also a financial cooperation. I mean, okay, people are sometimes nervous, sometimes happy with Chinese money flowing into Africa. But since this is a big change, it did not exist 15 years ago. And there is also cooperation between Brazil and Africa and so on and so forth. So, and most of the trade now is the South-South trade as well. So I think it's a big shift. We have to adjust to that new factor. And I used to say when I was at the World Bank that we should not deal with countries as a client, although technically they are client of a bank, but as partner. So to discuss together, what is it that we can work and do together? That's, I think, a very important shift in today's developing world.